Welcome to the rest of the news. Our special guest today is Dr. William Federer, who is at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention. Is that right?
Right, in Nashville, Tennessee.
In Nashville. And our other guest today is Kenneth Gary. So good to see you.
Nice seeing you, and nice seeing Dr. Federer also.
You know, Kenneth sent me an email about a week or two ago.
Yes.
When the president was on the prayer breakfast, and he gave me some information about what was in there, and I got it off the internet. And it seems to me that one of the things that I remember is where the president said something to the effect that Christians have to get off their high horse because they did the same thing during the Crusades that ISIS is doing now. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, the Crusades. I've found two different things I'd like to point out. When we talk about Muslims killing people and Christians killing people. The largest religion in the world is Christianity, about 33%. The second largest religion in the world is Islam, 22%. And so let's compare not the followers, but the founders.
Yes.
And so the founder of Christianity, Jesus, and the founder of Islam, Muhammad. Jesus never killed anybody. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people, including cutting off the heads of 700 Jews in Medina. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad got a fifth of the slaves taken in battle. Jesus never married. Muhammad had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives. He had slave wives and concubines. His youngest was a 6-year-old named Aisha. Jesus never tortured anyone. When Muhammad conquered Khaybar, it was the last Jewish settlement in Arabia. The Jewish chief refused to tell where the tribe's treasure was hidden. So Muhammad had him stretched out on the ground, and they kindled a fire on his chest. He still wouldn't tell, so Muhammad had him beheaded. Jesus did not force anyone to follow him. Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. Jesus taught that God was our Father. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus did not allow his disciples to rape anyone. Muhammad did, and there's all these hadiths that talk about how to do it. We begin to see a difference. The first 3 centuries of Christianity, there were 10 major persecutions, and Christians were thrown to the lions. They never led an armed resistance against the Roman emperor. The first 3 centuries of Islam, they conquered from Arabia to Paris. And so we begin to see this difference. Now, we hear some people saying that Muslims are peaceful, and others, like ISIS, saying, no, Muslims are violent. Well, the only way to settle the question is Muhammad. Muhammad was the perfect Muslim that ever lived. And so his life is the sunnah, which means the way or the example. So Muhammad's life went through 3 stages. He was a religious leader from 610 AD to 622 AD in the pagan city of Mecca, and he only made 70 converts in 12 years. He gets chased out of town for disturbing the peace. He goes north 210 miles to a Jewish city called Medina. The Jews are nice enough to let Muhammad in, but the Jews reject his faith, and so Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina, and he begins to organize a following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in a community, and he gets a following. He goes back to the Jewish leaders, presents himself as a candidate of change, that he's a newcomer to the politics of the city. The Jews make a treaty with Muhammad, and now he is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then the third step, Muhammad's followers in Mecca, they get argumentative, confrontational, threatening, the way some of his followers are today. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace, and they go north to Medina, and Muhammad permits his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad's attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate and take their caravan. And so Muhammad got a whole chapter of the Quran on how distribute booty from robbing caravans. In Surah 8, chapter 8. He gets a fifth of the booty. And so when the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad with 300 defeats them at the Battle of Badr, Muhammad takes this as confirmation he is supposed to be a military leader. And he fights 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He beheads 700 Jews in Medina, and he even used the catapult when he attacked a city called Al-Taif. When he was told the catapult was killing women and children, his response was, they are among them, so they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers today say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did. And since Muhammad is the perfect Muslim, Muslims that want to be better Muslims, they want to be like him, religiously, politically, and militarily. And so we see that the peaceful Muslim is, in a sense, backslid, and the violent Muslims are, in effect, the ones following the example of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs. So, the track record, there's a 1,400-year track record to observe Islam on the ground. And so there really is no mystery as to what it is that we're observing. So Muhammad, after he is turned into a warrior, the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers, 10,000 soldiers to Medina, and Muhammad, his warriors stop them, and Muhammad takes potholes and trenches all around the city, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless. And so this is when the Jews are chased out of the city of Medina. And then Muhammad's warriors, called the rightly guided caliphs, they conquer and conquer Egypt. People forget Egypt used to be Christian for 6 centuries. Then Muslims conquered Syria, which used to be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. Then Muslims conquered Egypt, which was evangelized by Mark, who wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then Muslims conquered North Africa. There used to be 240 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. In the 7th century, they were all wiped out by the Muslims. And then in the year 711, 80,000 Muslims invaded Spain. And then they conquered it, and they crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, and they were finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. So the Muslims go from Arabia to Paris in 100 years, and it is a military campaign. And so the ISIS killers today say that they are following the true example of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs by conquering and establishing this Islamic state. And then the Muslims come around the other side of the Mediterranean, and everything I just shared so far was the first Arab Spring, and it went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. The second is a Turkish Spring, and these Turks invade into the Byzantine Empire, what is today Turkey. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Turkish Muslims. The Greek Christians beg the West for help. The West sends help. It's called the what? The Crusades. So there's 9 major crusades in 200 years. Richard the Lionheart led the 3rd crusade. St. Louis, St. Louis, Missouri, right? He was the king of France. He led the 7th and 8th crusades against the Muslims. When the crusades end, the Muslims pick up where they left off, and they invade and conquer Constantinople in 1453. When Constantinople falls, it ends the land trade routes to get from Europe to India and China, and that is when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route to India and China. So Columbus would have never even set sail if it had not been for the Islamic State and ISIS killers. And then the Muslims invade into Serbia and Wallachia, Moldova, Hungary, and they even surround Vienna, Austria twice in 1529 and again in 1683. And it takes hundreds of years to drive the Muslims back. And finally, the Ottoman Empire is conquered in 1683 on September 11th, the Battle of Vienna. And then finally, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire is disbanded. And the Muslim world views itself as defeated. And that was the end of the second spring. But then we see the third spring. So the Muslim world is ruled by these kings and presidents who want to be friends with the West, because the West had airplanes and they were still riding on camels. And the Muslim world had these secular leaders that would dress in business suits, teach English in their country, send their kids to Western schools, like the Shah of Iran. He loved America. And then the Muslim Brotherhood was started in 1928, and this is the beginning of the third spring. The Muslim Brotherhood began to target these secular leaders who were friends with the West, and the West would prop up these secular leaders. And then oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in 1938. Saudi Arabia was the most backwards, poor Muslim country with mountains and sand, and in 10 years it became the wealthiest Muslim country. And so they went from this poor status to an extremely wealthy status, and so all the rest of the Muslim world decided to say, why be like the West to be blessed? Let's be like Saudi Arabia. So we flipped the switch. We turned on the magnet, like the little metal filings lining up. The whole Muslim world decided we want to be like Saudi Arabia and be blessed by Allah. And so we actually are responsible for making the Muslim world become more violent by drawing all the Muslim world to Saudi Arabia, which they have their Sharia law and the cutting off of arms and legs in Riyadh in their Chop Chop Square. And so the Muslim Brotherhood's goal is to pull the rug out from every one of these kings in the Middle East, get rid of the Shah of Iran. Our president calls Mubarak in Egypt on the phone and says, you're fired. Then our president takes out Gaddafi in Libya, so the Muslim Brotherhood can take over. The Muslim Brotherhood's goal is to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. And then he's moving guns through Libya, through Benghazi, to Turkey, to Syria, to arm the Muslim Brotherhood. And Russia comes to Syria's rescue. And so the Muslim Brotherhood is now killing Christians, and we decide we're going to fight them. And so we are actually sending money over there and arms over there to the very Muslims that are joining ISIS, and they're killing the Christians. And so we see that our government is complicit in this effort to establish the caliphate, to get rid of all these kings and leaders in the Middle East so that there can be this reestablished Ottoman Empire, this caliphate, and from there they want to take over the world. And
let me ask you one question.
Situation, and history gives us a perspective.
We're talking about President Obama that is backing.
Correct.
You know, the other thing he said is ISIS is not even Islamic. That was part of his statements that he has made. He said ISIS is not Islamic. How could he get that way? Because ISIS means Islamic State.
ISIS means the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq.
Yeah.
The president keeps wanting to call it ISIL, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And Levant means all of the Middle East. So it means Jordan and Lebanon and Cyprus and Israel. So whenever he says ISIL, he's basically conceding that they have the goal of taking over Israel.
The Crusades were similar to what ISIS is doing now, only it was ISIS and the Islamic people that were attacking the Christians back then.
Right. The goal from Muhammad on is to establish the caliphate, is to have since Muhammad went from being a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader, and he wants to bring the whole world into submission to Allah. So some definitions are helpful. The word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah. And Islam believes there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So to them, world peace means world Islam. So Islam is a religion of peace. It's just their definition of the word peace is different than ours. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. Their definition of peace is world Islam. Now, a moderate Muslim thinks the world will submit to Allah later, maybe at the end of the world, maybe it's figurative, and says it's so far in the distant future, just get along with your kafir infidel neighbor. That's fine. That type of Muslim has no problem living in a free democratic society like America. The fundamental Muslim, on the other hand, they think the world is supposed to submit to Allah now. And they're really excited. They want to help make it happen. Now, the dilemma for us in the West is the more we bend over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves tolerant, the more the modern Muslim begins to rethink. And and say, wait a second, maybe the world is in fact submitting to Allah now rather than later. And so they gravitate from the future peaceful modern camp into the fundamental now camp, which is the violent camp. So again, all of our efforts to show ourselves really, 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 really tolerant is actually creating more violence.
Yeah, I can see. Kenneth, do you have any other?
I would like to ask and see what you have to say about. I read an article that here in the United States, approximately 80% of the mosques are teaching to the Islamic radical view of caliphate.
Yes, and I apologize for not being able to hear exactly what you said there, so you may want to edit this up a little bit. So your statement was that 80% of the mosques in America are funded by Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia wants to set up the Islamic State. That's correct. Saudi Arabia is also the main publisher of Islamic textbooks. And we see that the situation is not just staying in the Middle East. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela has been bringing across Muslim terrorists from Iran to Venezuela for decades, teaching them Spanish and sending them north. And then we see there's Hezbollah and Hamas chapters in Venezuela, and they're taking over the drug gangs. You look at the Muslim populations of Brazil and Argentina, and it's growing. You look at the Muslim populations of Trinidad, Tobago, and Suriname. It's 10, 15, even 20, 25% Muslim. In Panama, where they were not going to have discrimination in housing, they want to build their Muslim apartment complexes as fortresses and practice Sharia law on the inside. And the Panamanians are like, well, if you're going to pay us money, we'll let you do it. And so we see that they're making strongholds, and they're coming across the southern border. They call them OTMs other than Mexicans. So a large percentage of those coming across the southern border are not Mexican. They are from Muslim countries, Somalia, Sudan, Turkey, Pakistan.
Wow.
And they're leaving Korans and prayer rugs in the Arizona desert, and they're coming across, and our government is busing them to cities all around America and putting them in Section 8 government housing.
Yeah.
And we are paying them on welfare and Social Security. And then we see in such large numbers, they're not assimilating. So 8,000 Somali Muslims are being moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming. Why? Well, they're going to be put in Section 8 housing, and they're going to maintain their cultural identity. And then it would be a perfect place for those that are fundamental Muslims to be able to recruit. And lo and behold, we could be seeing pockets of these Muslims in every city in America with their intent to have an Arab Spring.
May I ask you a question?
So we might have Fergusons all across America before the next election. And this might be a strategy that I hope I'm wrong.
Who's bringing all these Somali people into the United States? How did they, what brought them in?
I'd like to say one thing. Maybe Dr. Simon doesn't realize that, and I'm not sure if you do or not. But even today at the Louisville airport, there's possibly Somalis coming in. The women that are pregnant, their husbands could already be here. Soon as they get off from the plane and come in to meet their families here, they go to our hospitals to have their babies, and all at once, everybody's going to be able to stay in America.
Right, yeah. It is a strategy where they do the taking over for Islam through fighting and through population growth. And we see that in Europe, they're having one kid per family, where the Muslim male will have 4 wives, and it's culturally a stigma if each wife has less than 5 kids. And they put them all on welfare. And so the Muslim men are living like kings at the government expense while they're populating with Muslim children.
Well, is this immigration policy coming from the Obama administration?
Yes.
Also,
So I was in Detroit, Michigan, and a lady had a ministry to pregnant mothers, and she goes to a Muslim house and is giving a little gift, and out of a room comes another pregnant Muslim woman. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim woman. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim woman. They're all pregnant by the same man. He is practicing Sharia law in his house. And then someone else was telling me about Faisal and how he bought a bunch of houses on the street, has a wife in each one. They go down to the welfare office, say their husband's not around, and they get welfare. And he goes and impregnates them, and the more kids they have, the bigger the checks he's collecting, and all the kids in the middle of the street are his kids, and they're taking over the neighborhood. And then they take over a few streets and a few blocks, and then they take over a huge area, and they got 160,000 Muslims, and they vote in the police department, the fire department, the school boards, and they practice Sharia law in the schools in Dearborn, Michigan. And they have their prayer 5 times a day, and the girls are wearing burqas. And so we see that this is a process where you immigrate, increase, eliminate. You immigrate in as a religious person, you grow and get involved politically, and then you eliminate the previous culture, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, until you've taken over the city and eventually the country.
can I ask you a question? I have here a DVD of your presentation, and there are other DVDs on here. One is by Bridget Gabriel, and someone said to her, well, you know, only 20% of the Muslims are radical right now. And so she says, you can't really say they're radical. And she says, well, you know, the Nazis, only 20% of the Germans were Nazis. And so it doesn't really matter that only 20% because the others followed the Nazi policy. And the same thing with the communists in Russia, that maybe only 20% of the Russians were communists, but they controlled the rest of the Russians. So they, you know, even though only 20% were communists, they controlled the whole population. Would you want to comment on what she had to say?
Right. Historically, only 10 to 20% of the Muslims would dominate the Christian populations. And the Christians were called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I, dhimmi, and they were not allowed to own weapons. And they had to ransom their life once a year, pay this exorbitant jizya tax. And so all it takes is a minority that has the weapons, and then they extort the money from the rest, and so they're so bankrupt that they can't have a resistance. And then Muslims pass laws saying that the Christians cannot meet in secret. And if they speak out against the government, they get killed. And so they basically beat these down. It's very similar to the way the Democrats treated the blacks in the Deep South after the Civil War. Lincoln, Republican, freed the slaves. Democrats passed Jim Crow laws, black codes, and started the KKK and these vigilante groups. Yep. And so these huge populations of freed slaves were intimidated and beat down. And it's a terrible chapter in American history, but it is an accurate comparison as to how Christians are being treated today in Muslim countries around the world.
Well, you know,
9 out of 10 countries persecuting Christians today are Muslim countries.
You know, Obama in his presentation said that the Christians were behind the Jim Crow laws and slavery and all of that. He says, oh, well, those were justified by Christians. And here we find that it's not completely accurate what he's saying.
Yeah, prior to the Civil War, the country was divided into 5 categories. The extreme Republican North, they were called radical Republicans, and they said, end slavery now. And they used the Bible to say that Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Then you had the moderate Republican North that said slavery's wrong, let's transition out of it over time. And then you had the neutral middle ground that says we don't care about these social issues, we just care about money. And then you had the moderate Democrat South that said slavery's wrong, but we got to live with it, it's been here for centuries, just treat your slaves nice, have it be rare and few. And then you had the extreme Democrat South that said slavery's good, let's expand it into the new territories brought in after the Louisiana Purchase, and we spread it. So we have the Republicans. 1 out of every 10 lynchings was a Republican that got lynched because he was down in the South registering the freed slaves to vote. So it's not a Christian, non-Christian issue. It's a Republican-Democrat issue.
Right. And also, when caliphate comes about, they will build a mosque at the locations to expand their caliphate, just like when the towers were knocked down, and now 2 blocks away they want to put a mosque in.
Yeah.
Right. In Islam, Muhammad was the religious leader, a political leader, and a military leader. And so Islam is a religious system, a political system, and a military system. Our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split their profit. Muhammad was all three. And so the fundamentalist Muslims go to these backslidden Muslims and say, you need to get back to following Muhammad and the example of the rightly guided caliphs. And so a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. A bowing to Saudi Arabia is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And it is a complete system, religious, political, military. There's no separation of mosque and state. It's all together. And again, Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs conquered from Arabia to Paris in 100 years. And since they are the closest to the source, they're the best example. And we see this radicalizing taking place, especially because our government has chosen to side and back the fundamentalist Muslims.
Okay, listen, we're about out of time, Dr. William Federer, and we certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule here and filling us in on some of the important aspects of what's going on in America today.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let me just say one other thing. This video is free, and if you call us right now, it's about what Dr. Federer has said and about Bridget Gabriel and a whole lot more, and it's free. If you give us a call right now, 893-2444. That's 893-2444. And once again, thank you, Dr. William Federer and Kenneth Gary, for alerting us to all these things that are going on.
I do want to mention I have a website called AmericanMinute.com if anybody wants to visit it.
Listen, we're about out of time. We hope you will tune in again next week for the rest of the news.